And sorry I'm a few minutes late. Rather ironically for a free marketeer, the public transport, the trains worked perfectly, but the private transport, the taxi, was a disaster. So maybe I need to query some of my free market beliefs. I wanted to talk in very general terms, but I'm happy in questions and answers to get into any topics you want to get into, about what I suppose in modern debate and discussion is being portrayed as a crisis of capitalism. And I actually believe is a crisis of social democracy, and not a crisis of capitalism one little bit. And that the solutions to the key elements of this so-called present crisis are almost universally free market libertarian solutions, and almost universally not state interventionist solutions. So the first thing, the first myth I want to explode, if you like, is that, and this is a common critique of the left, is that this has been a failure of neoliberalism, that free market, unregulated capitalism has led us to this sorry past, that the banks have collapsed, and greed has been allowed to run rampant, and if only these things had been put into better check, we would not be in the colossal mess we are. I think all of the facts point to the fact that neoliberalism, at least in our lifetimes, has not been tried, so it cannot be said to have failed. But what has been attempted in basically every Western European country since the end of the Second World War has been social democracy. Now, social democracy is a relatively vague term, and I was trying to work out on the way up here how I would seek to define it. But what I mean by social democracy is that the market and price mechanism are allowed to generally operate in a large range of different areas, but there is highly substantial state intervention in the provision of a number of goods or services, very highly substantial redistribution of wealth, and that state spending accounts for a measurable proportion of overall GDP. I would consider, although there isn't a strict definition in the Encyclopedia Britannica or anywhere else, that if the state is controlling somewhere between sort of 35% and 55% of GDP and expenditure, that sort of proportion of national income, you are living in a social democratic society. I think much less than that, and you could claim to be living in a neoliberal free market society. Much more than that, and I think you would probably be saying we're living in an outright socialist society, at least from the point of view of economic planning. And to look at the statistics in the United Kingdom bear out this fact, and I better believe these are relatively typical if you were to compare them to other Western European countries. The exact trend is not the same, but the broad trend is. In 1870, when the United Kingdom was somewhere close, you might say, to the height of its powers, the proportion of GDP spent by the government was 9.4%. A little less than 10p in the then pound. Just before the Second World War in 1913, that had increased to 12.7%. Once you come out of a world war, where unsurprisingly state spending tends to go up, it seems to be extremely hard to get it back down again. So by 1920, we were up to 26% of spending all spending was by the state. This edged up to 30% in 1937, 32% by 1960. And since 1980, it has been around about the 40% mark, on some measurements having peaked at a bit more than 50% in the last year of the Labour government, and some measurements slightly more than 50% of GDP being spent by the UK government. The latest figure I have is that 2011 will be about 46%. This is a social democratic economy by any manner or measure of means. Similarly speaking, although there have been fluctuations here, if you were to look at it the other way around, tax rates. Any guesses as to what the top rate of income tax was in 1870? 2.1% was the top rate of income tax in 1870. That did go colossally high until Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. getting up to 88.75% at one point, with indeed 10% on top of that for some unearned income, so facing a tax rate of nearly 100%. That has been cut back, but of course we now have a top income tax rate of 50% on earnings over £150,000 a year. And when you consider other effective taxes on income, for example, national insurance contributions, the fact that if you're earning over £100,000 you start to lose your personal tax allowance, then those earning over £100,000 are sometimes facing marginal rates of taxation of 62%, which is a return to the sort of levels of taxation that we've witnessed under the most left-of-centre Labour governments in recent decades. So this is a social democratic country by any measurement or means. About a little over 1 in 5 of those in the workforce work directly in the public sector. It's harder to work out exactly how many people are effectively dependent on the public sector. You might, for example, be a builder who's all of your private company, nearly all of your contracts are coming from public sector contracts and the like. But 1 in 5 of the population are in work are employed directly by the public sector. And that's a number that has roughly doubled since Tony Blair, in raw terms, not in percentage terms, the total number of people in the public sector roughly doubled under the Labour government. And furthermore, over the last decade or so, productivity in the public sector, a difficult thing to measure. It's contentious exactly how you measure productivity in the public sector. There isn't a profit that you can, a profit motive by which you can measure the exact bottom line, but it's a mixture of things such as number of hours spent teaching, amount of face time with pupils, number of operations successfully conducted in the National Health Service and the like. It's a contentious measurement, but a fairly comprehensive measurement. Public sector productivity fell by about 3% in the last 10 years. Public sector pay rose by about 50% in the last 10 years. By comparison, private sector productivity increased by about 25% overall, and about 30% in the service sector of the economy. So the next time that you hear Brendan Barber from the TUC or somebody else complaining about Stephen Hester's bonus or somebody else receiving a £500,000 payout, that this is a reward for failure, you might very well want to look at the rewards for failure that have been given out in the public sector over the last 10 or 12 years. Fall in productivity and pay rises which overall amount to about 50%. Staggering. I challenge any banker to attempt to get away with that in modern Britain without being lynched. It's exactly what has happened in the public sector. So this is a social democratic economy and society, a heavily regulated one. There are, quite apart from the exact government spend, which is principally on welfare transfers, the National Health Service and education, principally on those three areas. If you add together welfare, education and health, you're looking at that amounts to, I think, nearly 2/3 of all government spending. But of course it isn't just about about money, it's about regulation. The number of regulations in the United Kingdom that apply to business, I think that's down to 21,000. The tax code, that is to say the tax rule book, is about 14,000 pages long. That, by my estimation, is something like 5 or 6 times the length of the complete works of Shakespeare, and is the longest tax code in the world, and by most measurements is considered to be the most complex tax code in the world. Again, don't be surprised when those who are potentially liable for large sums of tax employ very clever tax accountants to go through every last page of this tax code and work out how they can pay the lowest possible tax or shuffle around their money in particularly clever ways in order to avoid it. So a highly regulated, high spend economy, and one in which those who work in the public sector are being continually better treated and better remunerated than those in the private sector. It is difficult to compare salaries like for like, as you compare a nurse with a taxi driver. So some people claim that the comparisons of raw salaries between public and private sector are unreasonable and unfair. But if you do try and factor in the fact that people in the public sector are on balance slightly more qualified, you try and take that into account and various other features in account, then the median salary in the public sector is a little higher than that in the private sector. But the overall additional benefits of working in the public sector are extraordinary. Your prospects of being sacked or made redundant are enormously less than they've been in the private sector over the last 10 years. Your pension provision is extraordinarily generous. A nurse's pension is worth, i.e. what she or he would have to pay in order to secure it out of their salary, about 40% of their salary with the benefits that you get at the end. Virtually nobody in the private sector has a pension worth more than 10% of their salary. They could do, I could contribute another 30% of my salary to my pension if I chose to, but if you're a nurse in the public sector, you get that almost automatically. The statistic which chilled me, I've seen this revised upwards actually in recent days. It may be that there are some newer statistics of which I'm not aware. I better say that before I risk misleading you. But a few months ago, the statistic for the number of teachers fired for incompetence since 1945 stood at 18 through the entirety of England. This is either the most competent profession that mankind has ever witnessed, or they are a highly protected profession who are nearly impossible to punish for incompetence. So teachers have been fired for other things, sexual assault or whatever, but for incompetence, the numbers were utterly derisory. A number of people fired, obviously, for not cutting the mustard in the private sector, pretty high. This has led us to a pretty sorry pass, unsurprisingly. Official government debt stands at around £1 trillion, heading towards being about 100% of GDP, which is starting to consider to be the danger mark. But that, in fact, is an extremely optimistic view of the overall circumstances of the economy, that when you begin to factor in liabilities, not the raw cash debt, but liabilities, it's reasonable to say that the overall national debt is somewhere around £5 trillion. What I'm factoring in there are things like PFI contracts, which we've entered into and will have to pay. What I'm factoring in there are public sector pensions, which, although being reformed downwards a bit, we have a contractual obligation to pay. It requires you to make certain middle-of-the-road estimates about people's likely life expectancies and so on, but it seems reasonable to assume that there's another approximately £4 trillion of promised payouts, which we are going to have to find from somewhere. So that adds up to a national debt overall of around £5 trillion. In broad terms, about £80,000 for every man, woman and child in this country. That's the overall national debt. The way that the incoming coalition government have tackled this problem deserves, well, one cheer perhaps for at least recognising to some degree the nature of the problem. And it's not just the size and scale of the national debt, it's that we were worsening the national debt at a rapid and accelerating rate, thereby losing credibility. And so, of course, the coalition government has brought in this much trumpeted plan of fiscal consolidation, or cuts, as it tends to be known in the wider media. In my view, the government's plan have been, both by them and certainly by the media and certainly by the government's opponents on the left, spun out of all control of what they are actually attempting. It is George Osborne's plan, is his intention, to actually add £350 billion to the national debt between the day he took office and the presumed date of the election in May 2015. It is true that he will be adding to the national debt at a lower rate than the Labour Party would have done if Gordon Brown had been re-elected, but the national debt is nevertheless being added to. And he has put back the date at which he expects to get a balanced budget to something like a year or two into the next Parliament. So with every day that passes, millions more are being added to the national debt. It is, I think, on balance, just about fair to say that there are cuts happening. There is, for the first time in my lifetime, in fact, I think probably for the first time in anyone's lifetime who is presently alive today, we are going to see a government make cuts to public expenditure in real terms. In real terms, once you factor in inflation, the government will probably be spending a little less in 2015 than it is spending today. But that is to take a fairly optimistic view, i.e. to assume that the government hits its spending reductions. Governments typically, when they're aiming to cut by X, only manage to cut by 2/3 of X or a bit less than X. So I'm being rather optimistic to assume that. And even if the targets are hit, the overall reduction in government spending will equate to about 3 to 3.5% over the course of this Parliament. That is to say that this great process of fiscal consolidation will mean that in broad terms, for every pound that was being spent by Gordon Brown as he left office, about 96.5p will be being spent by this government as the next general election it takes place in May 2015. I think by any account that is an extraordinarily modest fiscal reduction. As I said, it is one that is adding to the overall national debt, and indeed the budget deficit itself may worsen if economic growth remains static, because the sort of tax revenues that the government is counting on are falling short in virtue of the fact that the economy is not growing at the rate that they either hoped or predicted initially. So social democracy has ended us in a right mess, and the changes that the present government are undertaking, I think, are the most modest changes that anyone sensible could possibly contemplate. It is as if they have arrived at the scene of a rather messy road accident and are sensibly applying a tourniquet to some of the wounds on some of the injured, but don't actually have any substantial plan for the rehabilitation of the patient. They are simply stemming the bleeding. I think in order to get the economy back in balance, and I think that this will be an agenda whose time is fast approaching, we need to look enormously more radically at cutting the size of the state. And the IEA put together a book called Sharper Axes, Lower Taxes, which advocated just exactly that. We found £242 billion of additional cuts in spending. That would reduce government spending to about 29% of GDP, rather than the near 50% that we're on at the moment. If you were willing to make cuts of that sort of order, an indication of what you could do on the tax side would be to have a single flat rate income tax, only one rate of 15%, no rate higher than 15%. Also cut corporation tax to 15% and cut VAT to 10%, from its present level of 20%. Notwithstanding that would actually be illegal under European Union law, but economically those are the things that you could do. So I think that there are a range of areas in which the government has to simply look at much, much greater and more substantial reform. The National Health Service is presently remaining ring-fenced. There is some political argument about whether spending really is going up, but it's certainly not being cut back in any enormous or meaningful way. And on most projections for the National Health Service to continue to offer the size and scale of the service it does at the moment, that is to say, treatment free at the point of use from cradle to grave for every British citizen, by 2030, spending on the National Health Service will have to double in real terms. That is completely inconceivable. There is absolutely no way that money can be found without the most enormous hikes in taxes or enormous reductions elsewhere. It would see the cost of the National Service double in 20 years. That's a time bomb which is not yet being tackled. Pension reform, which the government is tinkering with in the public sector, but is still ensuring that those who retire from the public sector will have a substantial part of their pensions basically unfunded, that is to say, paid for out of the public purse by the taxpayer, rather than an actual reflection of the money they themselves and their employers have invested. Considerably more needs to be done there. On welfare, I think that it is just quite extraordinary that we've managed to get ourselves into a situation in which times are tough and money is tight, but we nevertheless offer free bus passes, free television licences, and a winter fuel allowance to multi-millionaires of pensionable age. Absolutely extraordinary. So the affluent elderly, I think, need to have those stripped away from them. We've now managed to create a welfare system overall in which staggeringly 1 in 3 households in Britain are dependent upon state handouts for half or more of their national income. It's often the Social Democrats or those of a centre-left persuasion who call into aid Beveridge, the founder of the welfare state, as their great hero. Beveridge was pretty clear that the welfare state should be targeted only on a very small proportion of the overall population, certainly nowhere like a third, that it should only provide subsistence levels of support. And I think that it's interesting to look at the recent debate about the welfare cap in those sort of terms. I'm not saying a cap of £26,000 won't have an impact on some families, but I think it is hard to argue that £26,000 is below the level of subsistence. And finally, that welfare should only be, or at least in almost all circumstances, should only be given to people for a short period of time. This was intended to tide you over for a few months between jobs, not to be a case of 3 generations of a family living on welfare permanently. So I'd like to see considerably more done on the welfare side. On the regulatory side, it is unsurprising in my mind that the private sector has not, if you like, stood up to the plate in order to take on the number of jobs that are being shed in the public sector. Something like, I think it's about 400,000 jobs are expected to go in the public sector. And the private sector is not yet, with limited sluggish economic growth, stepping up to the plate to do that. This, in my view, is because of, in large part, because of government rules in the way of this. Taking on, I say this, if you like, not as the director of a think tank, but as somebody who runs a small business in virtue of being the director of a think tank, taking on a new employee is a very risky business now these days. If things go wrong, you can be sued for a substantial amount of money. The government are moving the rights of somebody to claim unfair dismissal. You'd have to have 2 years in service before you can do that rather than 1, but you can claim discrimination on a whole range of areas, and even if your case is entirely vexatious, entirely made up, the cost to me as your employer is very substantial indeed. And what we've seen in recent unemployment statistics, there's been a tendency for companies at the moment to, rather than take on new staff, to encourage their present staff to work longer hours, i.e. the trusted people on the inside who they know they're getting on with and are unlikely to have a problem with, are seen as less risky than taking on new staff. So oddly enough, although it sounds contradictory, I think actually making it easier to sack people would actually also make it easier to hire people. You would not be taking such a leap in the dark. I'm now quite convinced, because those of the free market persuasion were laughed at the time, but I'm now quite convinced that the national minimum wage is a barrier to employment as well. The main rate is now £6.08 an hour, which by my calculations comes into about £11,000 per annum. I mean, not the sort of salary on which you could, live a life of luxury with a wife and 4 kids and a nice house in the country, but not an absolutely abysmally low rate of pay, the sort of thing that a young person, perhaps still living with their parents, could easily get by on. That, I think, is actually now propping up unemployment at the youth side. That it is not surprising that we have 1 million young people out of work. It is simply too expensive for companies to take them on. Again, in my own experience, this is a barrier for me at the IEA. We get a lot of people writing into us saying, can we volunteer, or do you have any jobs going? If we have jobs going, they're advertised on the website, but I either effectively have to pay people £6.08 an hour or nothing in order to come in and work for us. I can take on volunteers. I can employ people at £6.08 an hour, but I cannot give people £3 an hour to help them get through. The consequences of this are pretty perverse. A, I don't take on as many young people as I always could, and B, those people that I do take on tend to be from more affluent backgrounds because they've got parents who can assist them, or in whatever way. It doesn't much matter whether they're earning naught rather than £6.08. people from a social background where 3 or 4 quid an hour might make a real difference, well, they don't get a look at it because it is illegal looking at people. 3 or 4 pounds an hour, I have to give them 0 or £6 and 8 pence. So I think we need to radically overhaul employment law. I think there's a case for substantial exemptions from regulations for small and medium-sized enterprises. We're making it difficult to get a company off the ground. One of the hardest steps for a company to take at the moment is to move from being a sole trader to taking on your first employee, because the number of regulations that you need to get around, health and safety regulations about your duty of care to them if you're running a window cleaning business or whatever. Again, the risk that you could be sued if things don't work out, the chances that they could take maternity or paternity leave are all very high. So I would like to see an SME sector which is exempted from large scales, large swathes of regulation, both in employment law, in health and safety law, in environmental health and the likes, and to move to an area in which a good number of businesses have the old Latin label caveat emptor, on the buyer beware, that you would know if you're walking into the building that this one might not have all of the fire safety standards that you could expect if you were walking into a fully licensed building, or if you're going to a particular restaurant, maybe it doesn't have all of the environmental health standards which are proudly advertised by the restaurant next door. Up to you to pick and choose where you want to go and eat and who you want to work for, but we should not have a one-size-fits-all regulatory culture. That would be my prescription. I just want to end by saying why I'm relatively optimistic that this will actually come to pass. There are a few. I think it would be a mild overstatement to say that these are facts, but there seems to be very strong and good evidence for them that I would want to draw people's attention. The first is, in anything approaching a free economy, it seems to be nearly impossible to tax the population at above 40% of GDP. Nearly impossible. Once you start putting taxes beyond 40% of GDP, you are on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Laffer curve, but the Art Laffer, the advisor to Ronald Reagan, who drew this Bell diagram saying, clearly if you tax people at 0, your revenues will be 0. If you tax people at 100%, your revenues will also be 0, because nobody will work if they're giving over 100% of their income. So at some point between 0 and 100 is the optimal rate of taxation on income. If you wish to maximise government revenues, there's a separate argument about whether the purpose of taxation should indeed be to maximise government revenues. Well, there's good evidence to suggest that in a broad basket terms, if you're taxing people more than 40% of their income, you are on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, that they are likely to emigrate, work less, give up work altogether, retire more quickly, not seek promotion, etc. So 40% is pretty much the most you can spend. You can spend more than that, of course, if you're willing to go to debt, which is roughly what we have done in the last few years. We're collecting in something around the high 30s in GDP and tax, and spending somewhere around the high 40s. So there is an automatic correcting mechanism that sooner or later catches up with you if you're spending more than 40% of GDP. Which is simply unsustainable over the long run. Secondly, it does seem that if you are spending much more than 25% of GDP, that you are severely, depending on how much more than 25%, you are beginning to dampen growth in the economy. That the effect of the state having such a large role means that economic growth is considerably less. Those states in the world which are taxing at around the 20-25% level, Hong Kong I think is about 25% of GDP, have grown extraordinarily rapidly. Communist China, the state accounts for about 17% of GDP. There are a number of aspects in which I would not want to praise the Chinese regime at all, but in terms of don't fall for the view that it is a traditional communist economic setup, in the sense that the proportion of the economy that is controlled by the state is around about a third of what it is in the United Kingdom. That is a hyper-entrepreneurial small state in terms of economic control. It's not a small state in terms of you being shot if you step out of line, but it is a small state in terms of economic control. In terms of keeping up, remaining competitive in the lingo with the rest of the world, you are going to have to see rates of government spend start to fall towards 15–20% of GDP, somewhere around there. It might not be a disaster if we get down to 25 or 28, but the forces of global capitalism are clearly going to force us in that direction. And finally, this is an observation rather than a suggested or imputed fact. It's my view that political structures can defy economic gravity for so long, but only for so long. And I have to be careful in drawing this parallel, not to sound utterly hysterical, but Soviet communism was able to defy economic gravity from, what was it, 1917 to 1989. Eventually, the forces of economic gravity brought it tumbling to the ground. Now, where I need to be careful is I don't actually think that Western social democracy is as horrific or as bad or easy to directly compare to the worst excesses of the Soviet Union. We do not tend to shove people into salt mines or round them up and shoot their family because the Stasi have been listening into them in the Western world. But nevertheless, the same basic principle of economic gravity applies. That if you continue to attempt to spend and grow the public sector beyond your means, your economy will crash and a different paradigm will have to be found. And in my view, that's exactly what is happening if you look over at Greece, Portugal, and increasingly other parts of the European Union, and that the UK itself is potentially teetering on the brink, I think overstates it, but had we continued to go in the spend direction that we were heading in over the past 5 or 6 years without beginning to at least apply a modicum of brake to it, we would have been potentially hurtling over the cliff as well. My very last point is on the banking crisis. One of the great frustrations, I think, for anybody attempting to argue for any free market reform anywhere is that your opponent will always say, oh yeah, but what about bankers? They caused this. Rampant free market capitalism caused this goddamn problem. It's all the fault of the crash of 2008 that this has all happened. All the people at the top of it should, if not be stripped of their knighthoods, then far worse, flogged in public, sent to prison, struck off, whatever, have their assets seized. The problem was in the banking sector. Now this to some degree has truth in it. There is no doubt that the banking crisis caused a substantial turn down in GDP, which we are only very, very slowly beginning to recover from. And it looks like it might take until perhaps 2014, 2015, somewhere around there, until we are back at the levels of GDP income that we had in 2008. This is quite a serious dip, and there is no doubt that the financial crisis was the trigger for that dip. I think it was Warren Buffett, however, who said, when the tide goes out, it is the time when you can work out who is swimming naked. And we certainly found ourselves swimming naked. We were not prepared for any drop in GDP. Government spending was predicated on the view that growth would go on forever, and any disruption in the financial services sector of the scale that we saw simply wasn't planned for and therefore catastrophic because the deficit spiraled out of control. We were just working on the assumption that the financial services sector would just continue to grow and grow and grow year in, year out as the engine of our economy. And all bets were off when that failed. But the great myth here is that the banking sector was a model of neoliberal capitalism. It was not. It is not. It is, I think, probably the most regulated sector of the economy in the United Kingdom, with the possible exception of nuclear materials, maybe the second most regulated sector of the economy in the United Kingdom. It is not a free, libertarian, market-orientated structure at all. There have been implicit guarantees of state bailouts and actual state bailouts. The moral hazard involved in this is completely obvious. Imagine any line of business in which you know that if your gamble goes wrong, the taxpayer is coming to your aid. You would surely expect to find rather reckless gambling behaviour. I'll tell you right now, if I believed that at the end of the year any deficit racked up by the Institute of Economic Affairs was going to be written off by the taxpayer, I would be taking colossally more gambles than I'm taking with the IEA's money right now. We have a deposit guarantee. The first 80 grand of any money you put into a bank is guaranteed by the taxpayer. This is why you will find that every banking advert you see is, we'll give you extra or you'll get a better rate of return with us. Not bank with us because we won't lose your money, because that's already taken care of by a state guarantee. The scale and quantity, I'm afraid I didn't have a chance to look them up before I came up here, of the regulations that you need to comply with if you work in the financial services sector are simply astonishing. And I think have been one of the drivers towards the too big to fail structure. I was talking to a friend who ran a very small bank, or not a bank, a small financial enterprise in the financial services sector. He sold up to UBS because with his 20-man operation, he needed 5 or 6 people just to work on regulatory compliance. If that's the burden of regulatory compliance, then expect more and more big structures to emerge and entry into the marketplace to be damn near impossible. Metro Bank, which is just being set up as we speak, I don't think it's quite gone live yet, will be the first new bank to be set up in England in 150 years. It shows, I would suggest, that the barriers to entry, state barriers to entry in banking are colossal and impeding competition. And it is actually effectively a highly state-regulated area with enormous state involvement and state bailouts. That is not capitalism, that is state socialism. And that state socialist structure has been really the cause of the crisis, and major banking reform in a more libertarian direction is needed. So, we live in a social democracy. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. I consider that to be a matter of fact as well as a matter of regret. We do not live in a neoliberal capitalist state. The limits in practical terms of that social democracy have now been stretched to the absolute limit. We are in a serious debt and deficit scenario. We are not showing an ability to get public spending trimmed back or under control at anything like the speed or level that we would need to do if we want to do anything other than merely stop the bleeding. The banking crisis was a crisis of state and regulation, not a crisis of free market liberalism, and the only sensible, credible route out of this is a radically diminished state down to something like 20–25% of GDP, in broad terms about half its present size, but that we can be confident that this will be the sort of future that people your age are likely to see in perhaps 20 or 30 years' time, because, to use Margaret Thatcher's often-used phrase, there is no alternative. Thanks very much for your time and attention. Sorry if I wanted to.
And now feel free to ask questions, not be too politically correct. And get
Certainly don't be politically correct. I implore you, don't be politically correct.
Who wants to go first? Tom.
Do you think in order for Britain to realise its economic potential in the way you set out, we need to pull out the European Union?
Yes, this is a really interesting question for me, this one. My first job in politics was to work for the European Movement, a pro-European organisation. And on my CV, which despite the efforts of my press department to keep knocking off my Wikipedia entry, I was about 20 years ago not really working for the European Movement, but I was the president of the Young European Federalists of the United Kingdom. So I have fallen on this issue, and I might as well confess to my crime sheet right now. My worry about it, and I will come to your question in a minute, my worry about it is I think it is, I think that the European question, in my view, is an empirical one. I don't believe that there is any reason, automatic reason, why the effective merger of countries should necessarily be illiberal. You can imagine a lot of things that could be hugely liberalising. Free movement of people, free movement of capital, far better for trade, effective tariff barriers withdrawn, and I think, hugely imperfect where it was, there was a good case that the single market did that. I can remember, well, I say I can remember, I can vaguely remember, so I may be out on some of the details here, but the broad image I'm about to paint is a fair one. The regulations relating to tractors prior to the introduction of the Single European Union Act. Now, one might as a libertarian say there just shouldn't be any regulations relating to tractors, but we live in a second best world, there's a lot of tractor regulations. The regulations prior to the Single European Act, which have now put together one uniform set of tractor regulations, went something like this. In Portugal, the ratio between the front tyres and the back tyres had to be 2 to 3, whereas most other places it was 3 to 4. In Belgium, the thickness of the glass on the various windows had to be at least a quarter of an inch thick, which I think was some deal they cut with the Belgian glass industry to make sure that effectively a state subsidy of the Belgian glass industry. In Finland, there had to be an escape hatch on the top of every, God knows why you just use the door, an escape hatch on the top. And so it went on. And the consequence of these different regulations was that an economy of scale was impossible. You could not create a tractor that was fit for purpose in all of the European Union market. Now, I prefer a sort of wholly deregulated system that we're not going to try and define a tractor. You can put together any set of wheels you want and try and sell it to any farmer who's willing to buy it. But as a second best solution, that doesn't strike me as being illiberal or anti-capitalist. However, I think pretty much everything that's happened since has gone in the wrong direction. Even the single currency, which in certain circumstances one can imagine being a force for good, at least in fiscal terms, there are problems about currency area theory and the like. But if you remember the Maastricht criteria, was all members had to promise they wouldn't be borrowing more than 3% of budget deficit each year, that their overall national debt would never be more than 60% of GDP. These were the sort of rules that I was quite attracted to as a fiscal conservative, but they've been observed in the breach. I think the only country in the Euro that has stuck to the Maastricht criteria has been Luxembourg. Well, that would be a pretty small currency with just Luxembourg involved. So clearly all of it, I think, is now pushed in the wrong direction. So I think that a departure or a renegotiation, at least, of our relationship with the European Union is we're beginning to get to the point where that may very well be a necessity. Be careful, though. There are some people who I think are, if you like, on the Eurosceptic free market side, who, without saying it, imply a rather rose-tinted view of the world, that the Whitehall civil servants and bureaucrats are these kind of fire-in-the-belly libertarians who are being held back by these awful socialists in Brussels. This ain't so. The Whitehall bureaucracy and its tendency to regulate, over-regulate and intervene is, in my view, pretty much of a muchness with the European bureaucracy. I mean, to take the famous one on, one of the great Euro jokes about the Euro rules governing the curvature of fruit. The banana has to be curved in this particular fashion, or it doesn't count as a banana. Completely insane that we've got these sort of rules. But the Brits have had rules about fruit sizes and shapes since the 1960s. It was not a libertarian fruit paradise in the United Kingdom before we joined the European Union. And my concern is that, if you like, you could imagine arguing that it's a necessary condition for a radically deregulated free market approach to Britain to leave the European Union. You could imagine that. But it is certainly not a sufficient condition. That the statist influences, the power of the bureaucracy, the social democratic interventionist instincts of our politicians and civil servants are much of a muchness with the nonsense that comes out from the Eurocrats. So quite possibly, but it is not a panacea. Sorry, your chair, you take the next question.
What is your view specifically on Margaret Thatcher's attempt and success in trying to bring us back to neoliberalism?
Probably my view of her is a rather more modest one than some of my fellow travellers, actually. I think that you could say that there were certain really key areas of success in terms of breaking the stranglehold of the trade unions, for example. I mean, that was a you know, a colossally successful overhaul in labour law. The privatisation of a whole range of industries, which 10 or 15 years previously would have been considered, you would have been considered nuts if you were advocating their privatisation, and now you would be considered nuts to suggest that they should be renationalised. I mean, the idea was controversial to privatise British Airways. I mean, that the taxpayer should have an airline that they control, or BT. I mean, I think one of the very earliest Institute of Economic Affairs pamphlets from the 1950s, early 1960s perhaps, was, you know, perhaps we could actually move to a private free market in telecoms. The IEA was completely mad to suggest this. You know, you clearly needed a nationalised telephone exchange, and anybody who said different was a complete lunatic. Well, I mean, the IEA were proven right. Okay, I mean, that battle has been won, and decisively so. And I think that, I'm not a political historian, but I think it would be true to say, if you look back at the time, these things, her great triumph in office was to render these things, which are hugely controversial at the time, are now an almost totally accepted part of the landscape. But I think that Ed Miliband and the Labour Party get quite a number of things wrong, but some of the comparisons with Michael Foot's Labour Party are unfair, because Foot was advocating nationalising the entire FTSE 100, I think, at one point, which not even Miliband and Balls would go close to now. So that was a big one. Union reform, or at least removal of the union's influence on power, and the privatisation programme was hugely successful. But, and I think it's fair to say that in terms of sort of supply side reform, I mean, you know, getting the top rate of tax down from whatever it was, 90% to 40% was, and proved the Laffer curve point, revenues went up. However, in cash terms, she did not shrink the size of the state. Spending did not go down enormously under Margaret Thatcher. It didn't go down at all. I don't think it even went down as a proportion of GDP. It's going to be corrected in that regard. But government spending continued to go, it's not fair to say unchecked, but continued to go up. And I think that that's the really great political and economic challenge of my generation and your generation, is how to tackle that. I'm not saying that, you know, there isn't regulation that we need to extinguish and get out of the way. Clearly there is. But if we cannot find a way to stop the inexorable rise of state spending year on year, more or less year on year, and if we consider culturally that trimming spending by 0.7% per annum, what George Osborne's trying to do, is some sort of holocaust of public spending. If that's where we are mentally, we're doomed. We're absolutely doomed. And Thatcher's legacy doesn't really give us any pointers in that regard. So the privatisation programme, fantastic. Broadly, the trade unions reform to be warmly welcomed. But on the state spending side, she didn't crack.
Something. And so the first speech, I totally agree with you that there's a very big problem with the huge state spending, but I'm also wondering that if that's the free market can solve everything. For one thing that you said about the banking crisis, I think that it's true that the conventional banking is heavily regulated. It's part of dealing with people's savings and doing the loan, but on the other side, when you talk about like investment banks or non-bank financial institutions, it's quite true that they are very highly deregulated, especially dealing with the derivation market. For example, the subprime mortgages. It's kind of true that they are very like free markets and heavily deregulated. So that's all to say about that is. So I think that it's quite not very conceiving to say that this crisis is kind of crisis of state. And another part is that we can see that there's can be sometimes market failure, right? So if the free market sometimes may failure itself, so do they need to some extent some kind of regulation from outside those market? So what do you think about that?
Okay. I mean, on the financial services side, I mean, well, you're not going to be surprised to know that I'm going to try and rebut both of your propositions. On the financial services side, and this goes a bit to your market failure point, it's not my view that in a free market, no business ever fails. No company ever goes to the wall. Nobody ever makes a mistake. That's not my view at all. Mistakes regularly happen. But I want to live in a society not in which banks never go bust, but a society in which when a bank does go bust, I don't need to lie awake at night panicking that the entirety of Western capitalism is about to go down with it. So this is a gross simplification because banks are more complicated institutions than department stores on the high street. But as far as possible, I want a bank going bust being a bit like Woolworths going bust a year or two ago. It's a shame. All of the shareholders lose all of their investment. That's a big shame for them. All of the people who work for Woolworths lose their jobs. Yep, I'm very sorry for them. I lose the right and ability to take my 5-year-old nephew to the pick and mix counter. That's a great shame for me. But the world keeps on turning on its axis. And the experience of sort of the pre-regulated banking and financial services sector, in fact the IEA, which I'm glad you said you haven't brought it up, and you did a paper, it does put in need of financial regulator, was that you would get quite continual failures. I mean, banks would go to the wall. But there was no disaster was involved in this. You know, the world kept on going. And I think that the problem, partly through regulatory means, is we got into a too big to fail situation. But it's now nearly impossible to run a small bank because of the regulatory burden. In terms of subprime lending, there's a good case to say, I'm not saying that this is the entire cause of the banking collapse. This was an enormous government intervention by the Clinton administration. They prohibited, and you may say on noble grounds, on the grounds of a concern about racial discrimination in banks, that you could not refuse a mortgage on the basis of a zip code or a postcode area. You couldn't take that into account in your decision about whether to lend. And the thinking behind this was that banks were showing a propensity to lend money for essentially disproportionately to white people in the relatively affluent areas of their particular state, and to turn down loans being sought by black people disproportionately in relatively poor areas of the state. This became legal and subprime lending became mandatory. This was by government and state diktat, not a reckless decision by the banking industry. The banking industry did not want this brought in. On the wide point of market failure, I think we've got to be extremely careful about what we mean by market failure. And to my mind, the terminology is starting to be used to mean anything ever going wrong. That's not what a market failure is. All sorts of things go wrong. As I say, companies go bust, people lose money. That is not a market failure. A market failure is something which you genuinely believe that the free market, which is basically like desired by the overall population, there is a demand for it, but for some reason the supply isn't coming forward. And to my mind, it is difficult to think of too many such examples. There are some. I think it would be difficult to have a free market in Trident nuclear missile weaponry. I think that probably would need to be provided by the state. There are some issues about policing, but I think even that can be made much more marketised than it is at the moment. So I'd better back to you and say, what market failures are you particularly looking at? By which I don't mean that a free market society guarantees human perfection with every action, of course not. But what sort of failure, what do you think needs to be or should be provided that can't be best provided by free market mechanisms? And I think that there are very few of those. If it might be that you wish to bring about a society which isn't a market-oriented society for other reasons, but it is not a market failure that there isn't a completely equal distribution of income in the United Kingdom. That's not a market failure. That might be something that you want to achieve. I'm sorry, I'm describing all sorts of weird views to you, which I'm sure are completely unfair. But that might be something you want to achieve. But that's not a market failure. That's simply the market failing to deliver your preferred outcome. So I think that we need to be pretty careful about that. And we've certainly got ourselves into a position in which we apparently see market failure everywhere. And the other point about this, of course, goes into sort of public choice theory economics. But even if you can point to areas where markets fail, or there is market failure, it does not automatically follow that there will be bureaucrat success. All of the sort of problems that come out from market failure seem to me to be almost always considerably worse when you consider the state riding to the aid. And so even in cases of pure market failure, there just seems to be this assumption that the state and the experts and the mandarins and the politicians will be able to sort this and get the answer right, rather than that the state and the politicians and the mandarins will probably make even more of a haul of something. And the experience seems to be the second. So sort of omniscience is often ascribed to the various mechanisms that will be used to correct market failure, whereas in fact they are anything other than omniscient and are often considerably worse in virtually every aspect to the decision-making mechanisms that we have at the market level. And I mean, just to underscore that point, sometimes I think that opponents or skeptics about free market capitalism put up a straw man, that they sort of claim that people like me are suggesting that, you know, utopia would come about if only we had a perfect free market, that nothing would ever go wrong, you know, no one would ever die, no one would ever get sick, everybody would be brilliantly educated, PhD level in 27 subjects, everyone would live in a mansion and have a swimming pool. The claims made by supporters of the free market are rather much more modest than that. Simply that this is the best decision-making mechanism that we have at our disposal. Not that it will always produce the perfect results, but it is the best mechanism to produce the best results we can. And my claim would be no stronger than that, mixed in with an enormous cynicism and scepticism about the experience of attempting other means of economic management and control, all of which seem to me to have been deeply, deeply suboptimal, and have in almost every aspect and in almost every country at almost every time they have been tried, have led to worse outcomes than one might reasonably have expected from a free market.
Okay, before we take the next question, may I please ask that you introduce yourself briefly, unless you don't want to, which is fine. Well, to everybody. Also, I would really welcome questions from opposing points of view, especially to Labour members who've been so very kind to join us. But feel free to
Put it on the spot. You don't need to say who you are, but I will identify the political party you're from.
So, do I have to go on a question now? Or
My name is John. What's your opinion of Workfare, which is the government scheme to make certain individuals work for their benefits at like staffing shelves that live for Tesco's, which were that's £2 minimum wage, like a wage of £2 an hour. Yeah.
This is a really difficult one. It's like when anybody asks me when I think about abortion or fox hunting, and I change my mind on it about every day. On the one hand, I don't like the state coordinating enforced work programs for potentially hundreds of thousands of people. That smacks to me of a rather coercive, authoritarian state structure that I recoil from. On the other hand, and the other potential threat here is that unemployed labour is put to work undercutting present labour, and therefore you get an enormous and unfair reduction in the prevailing market rate. You know, every I don't know, toilet cleaner and street sweeper is thrown out of work and replaced by somebody who's now having to do it in order to obtain their benefits. Those are the downsides. The second best world in which we live in, one in which there is an absolutely colossal workfare state, way, way beyond, by several factors, any sort of dimension that Beveridge ever intended or conceived of. I think there is a case for it. And the reason is this. Having found ourselves, which Ian Duncan Smith is making some efforts to get us out of, having found ourselves in the absolutely ludicrous position whereby you could impoverish yourself by taking a job, that you would literally, a range of individuals, perfectly plausible individuals in family households that you could construct hypothetically, in which entering the workforce at a reasonably low-level job, you know, working in a fish and chip shop or something, would be financially disadvantageous. It's right to my mind that that needs to be corrected. That is is a preposterous situation, and you will unsurprisingly find unemployment statistics reacting to that economic reality. I don't think that the British population are necessarily work shy, but I do think they're clever. And if you make it more financially advantageous to not to work than to work, and especially if the job is not a particularly fulfilling job on an obvious career ladder, you're very unlikely to work. I mean, I think the first job I took when I left university was in 1995, and I think my salary was £13,000, and all that being maybe £20,000 in today's terms. And I calculated at the time that once you then built in that I couldn't claim any housing benefit, I'd have to pay for my prescriptions on the National Health Service, I'd have to pay full council tax rather than that coming back once you knock off the tax of what I was earning. I think my calculation at the end of it was, for doing a 40-hour week, 50 weeks a year, I'm going to be £300 better off this year. Not a particularly attractive spot price. Of course I did the job, because it was an interesting job. I'm lucky, quite a skilled person, university educated. I could see that this was going to put me on a career ladder that would go on the, hopefully on the up and up, whereas potentially, I don't know, working in a fish and chip shop, serving fish and chips doesn't necessarily have that same career path. The problem, however, I think with the present situation is if you don't close the leisure gap, then financial incentives may not be enough. So it seems to me, and I'm sure that somebody in the Department of Work and Pensions could correct me on these exact numbers, but in broad terms, what they're going to make sure happens is, if you go and take the job in the fish and chip shop at 10 grand a year, we guarantee that you won't be worse off. We'll take with the removal of your benefits, you will be better off. But let's say you're only going to be better off by a few £100 per annum, and you're going to have to be spending 40 hours a week or so sweating away in front of a battering fish and battering chips in rather unpleasant conditions. You might say, well, it's not worth it for 500 a year. Yeah, there is a financial incentive there. At least we would have got rid of that mania from the system, that you will at least be better off. But is that enough? And in Wisconsin, where they trialled Workfare to some considerable success, what they found was not, very quickly, right, the broad rules being, if you are able-bodied and claim you are fit to work, you've got to turn up at the park gates at 8 o'clock every morning and pick up leaves, dig holes, or whatever it might be. It was all work, as I understand it, which otherwise wouldn't be done. They were not putting park wardens, they were insistent they weren't going to put park wardens out of business. It was all stuff that otherwise wouldn't be done. On an economic value to the people of Wisconsin of nearly zero. It was digging holes and filling them in again. The consequence very quickly in Wisconsin was, rather than having platoons and platoons of hundreds of thousands of people digging holes and filling them in again, these people, as if by magic, suddenly found themselves jobs in the private sector. So it became a further incentive to take that job at the fish and chip shop, because the alternative was digging a hole and filling it in again for 10 hours a week. So I'm attracted to it on that basis as a suboptimal second best option. I think, given the state and size and scale of the welfare state we have, if you allow the leisure gap to exist, which it does at the moment, i.e. the amount of free time you've got on your hands to be as big as it is at the moment, then we will continue to have a problem to properly incentivise people to take perfectly acceptable jobs.
But there's an argument that those jobs aren't really, there's no kind of sort of incentivised job in itself. Like, you had an incentivised job, it wasn't economically incentive for you, as you said, but it's those kind of jobs aren't, like, where is that? They're not how an incentivised job isn't there for a lot of people.
Well, I suppose what I'm saying is this goes to carrot and stick. I'm not making it enormously more attractive to work in a fish and chip shop by saying that the state will magically double your salary. I'm just making it less attractive to not take the job in a fish and chip shop. So in terms of where the incentives lie, it's a question of getting that carrot and stick correct. So at the moment, I don't want to sound like your traditional Daily Mail columnist, well, I do write for the Daily Mail. At the moment, you in effect have the choice of sitting at home and claiming, let's say it's 12 grand a year, or taking this job at the fish and chip shop for £12,500 a year. The chance that you're going to sit at home and get out of bed when you want, and watch telly when you want, and go for a walk when you want is high. And I think unless you have a very strongly implied duty to work before you get any money, I mean, if you're rich enough that you just want to drop out of society altogether and you know, not ask me to write and give you your welfare checks, fine. But I think that it is reasonable to say that there is a duty to work if you possibly can. And if you are claiming you can't find a job, we will find something to keep you busy. And keeping that person busy then encourages the take-up of these, frankly, not particularly high-grade jobs in the public sector, in the private sector, like working in fish and chip shops and the like. And a lot of, this is anecdotal, okay, it is anecdotal, but speaking to a lot of employers who are, you know, looking for relatively cheap, pretty unskilled labour, you know, picking fruit on farms, that sort of stuff, packing boxes in a factory, nothing very glamorous about it, find it very hard to fill those jobs because the market rate for them is not much better than the benefit rate that you could reasonably collect. Now, if the market rate wasn't much better than the benefit rate you could collect, but by collecting those benefits you were having to do 40 hours a work week anyway, digging holes and filling them in again, you may then be much more attracted to take this private sector job. So it's a question of the use of the stick there, rather than simply the carrot. Do you want to come in? Okay, sorry.
No, you go ahead first.
Hi, I'm Basim. I just have a question. Do you think that the UK would be better off abolishing monarchy?
I don't know, this is a blimey. I'm getting all these. Someone's going to ask me how to solve the Northern Ireland problem. My instincts are pretty Republican myself. I think that it's, no, I mean, no offence to Queen Elizabeth II or any of her families intended by what I'm saying, but I think it's pretty preposterous that we have a constitutional structure in which we have a monarch apparently appointed by God and a House of Lords then appointed by the monarch. And, I mean, it seems to me a complete anachronism and arbitrary. And I think probably has, I don't want to overstate this, but probably has negative cultural connotations of reinforcing a more class-based society rather than a more socially mobile society. I cannot aspire to be the monarch of the country, and I don't want to overstate how that might dampen people's ambition, because there are a million other factors at play. But my sense is in Republican countries, like the United States of America or Australia, there's more of a go-get, social mobility is possible attitude. And I'm concerned that the monarchy, and then indeed all of the trappings around it, you know, Duke this and Duchess the other and Baroness whoever it might be, creates a cultural, if not an actual, approach against social mobility. So I lean, I think, on balance to saying we'd probably be better off without the monarchy, but the costs associated with unravelling it, it's not very high on my list of priorities. I mean, of the various things I want to do in my first 100 days of office, it wouldn't be one of them. I've never really bought the tourist argument. You know, we've got to keep the Queen in Buckingham Palace because otherwise no American's ever going to bother to visit these shores again. I don't find it a particularly compelling argument. And I don't even think that such an argument should out-trump good constitutional theory. I mean, I'm sure if we brought back public executions in Hyde Park and sold tickets for 50 quid a time, we would probably, you know, that's pretty good for tourist trade, actually. We're selling quite a lot of these tickets. And let's up the number of people we're executing. You know, very good for the tourist trade. I'm not, and it may well be that would be good for the tourist trade, but I don't think that out-trumps what should be good constitutional theory. So I think, on balance, it's not ideal. We've got it. I think that there are problems with it that go beyond the constitutional, but I think, as Douglas Adams would say, and his quote from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy describing planet Earth, and being my quote of describing the Queen, mostly harmless. Mostly harmless.
Okay.
Thanks. Greg Judge. I might return to a policy question later if I have time, but if I could just return to party politics for a moment. What is your interpretation of the creation of the Liberal Left group within the Liberal Democrats? Is it a welcome addition or a unwanted distraction? And how do you think the right of the party and parties, Labour and Conservative, will react to that creation?
For those who haven't seen, there's a new group that's been set up called Liberal Left, which is for an internal ginger group within the Liberal Democrats, which seeks to rally Liberal Democrats who are opposed to the coalition, don't like working with the Conservatives, and potentially see an alternative alliance emerging at some, I think, undetermined point in the future with the Labour Party and the Green Party. But I don't consider it unwelcome when people organise political things that I disagree with. I'm not, not that kind of right of centre person. So, I mean, more power to the elbow of anybody who is, setting up any particular group to promulgate their ideas. I think that what it shows, and to be clear, I used to work for the Liberal Democrat Party, but since joining the IEA, I surrendered my membership card, so I'm independent. I'm not a member of the Liberals. Well, I think what it shows is that the Liberal Democrats are frankly not a very coherent political party. Not so much even a broad church, more of a cathedral that encompasses within it, and I don't say this critically because I was one such person, encompasses within it people who would tend to have the following features. Broadly speaking, internationalist, to some degree. Broadly speaking, I'm going to go so far as to say pacifist, but is pretty sceptical about military intervention. Broadly speaking, pretty pro-civil liberties. And broadly speaking, what was the other one? Pro-civil liberties, internationalist, pacifist, and broadly speaking, pro-constitutional reform.
Hard to count up. It's hard to count up.
Yes, those four, I would say, bring people together. But you could hold those four positions and have wildly different views about what the taxation rate should be, what we should do about the National Health Service, what we should do about education. Wildly different views. You could hold those. You could be a sort of pro-civil liberties, pacifist, pro-internationalist sort of person who believes in, nationalising virtually everything that moves. Or you could hold those opinions and be pretty much like Ron Paul. So the diversity of views on what I would consider to be the really major points of policy, philosophy, the Lib Dems have just ducked. So that they have, in the breadth of the Liberal Democrat Party philosophically, is enormously wider than the breadth of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, because it just contains so many incoherent elements, each coherent in their own way perhaps, but that does not add up to what you could even broadly call a view of the world, other than there are 3 or 4 things which would usually give people good reasons to why they hadn't joined one of the other 2 main parties. So I suspect that the outrun of all of this, I think all of that was holdable together whilst the Liberal Democrats went around getting 20% of the vote, mainly for being, in large part for being a kind of nice party that nobody took a great deal of umbrage against, and were a good way of either casting a protest against the other 2 parties, or a good way of electing a nice person in your area rather than evil Tory or evil Labour person, delete as applicable. I think that sort of, that mix was feasible. I think when you actually get into coalition and actually have to start making decisions, the absence of an obvious moral compass has become fairly obvious, and the differences between different individuals and wings of the party. I mean, the difference between David Laws and Simon Hughes was just absolutely, it's a gulf. So I wonder whether the Liberal Democrat Party is actually likely to survive over the next 10 or 15 years in its present form, or whether those who are comfortable with the coalition will find some sort of rapprochement with the Conservatives, and those who are uncomfortable will find some sort of rapprochement with Labour, or will set up some alliance with the Greens. I mean, I don't know, there's a million ways it could happen, but it does seem to me that the number of things I'm going to get this the wrong way around, the central fugal force that was keeping Tim Farron and David Laws together has now potentially become a central penal force that would tend to drive them apart. I'm not particularly picking on those 2. Please don't, pick up from this. I've spoken to either of them, and either of the 2 of them is planning on leaving the party anytime soon. I don't think there's any plot in that regard, but it just seems to me that's the way that the natural forces are moving. And although I said there's a whole plethora of different views in the Lib Dems, you could broadly categorise it as one block, probably the majority block of the grassroots members, and even the MPs and local councillors, broadly sort of leftist liberals, social democrats in terms of economic policy, by and large, believe in quite high taxes, a lot of government spending, heavily redistributive, so continue to pile more tax on millionaires and tax their mansions and less tax on those at the lower end of the scale. A social liberal and very environmentalist, a liberal left party. And the other wing of the party, which I would say numerically is smaller, but has rather cunningly captured the party leadership. It was put to me the other day by a senior political journalist that actually all three main political parties have all been subject to a coup in the last 15 or 20 years. Blair, Cameron, Clegg. And the coup has actually only been carried out by about 4 people in each case. It's not them and their army behind them. But that wing of the party, which is much more like what you could call mainstream European liberals, the groups in ELDR and others who are classical liberals, the German FDP and VVD in, is that Holland or I think that's the Dutch VVD, isn't it? And definitely the groups that the Liberal Democrats sit within the European Parliament take a much more, in my view, consistent philosophical line which believes in a small state and personal freedom across the board in economic areas as well as in social areas. So I'm not really sure how it all hangs together ad infinitum. I mean, the party has shown a tremendous history of struggling through even the bleakest possible moments, so it may be foolhardy to write them off. I wouldn't want to write off the Liberal Democrats. But it seems to me that there are now forces at work which raise existential questions about the future of the party. And I think that that is reinforced by the failure to secure electoral reform. If one assumes from the defeat of AV that we are now going to have first past the post for at least another 30 or 40 years, then one of the things that Liberals and Liberal Democrats always had to cling on to since the Second World War was, well, yeah, it might be damn near impossible at the moment, but any minute now we might get PR. And therefore any minute now we'll suddenly be able to shoot through the glass ceiling. The only reason that people don't vote for us is we can't win. All of that is rescinded if PR comes through. We'll suddenly be a party, rather than getting 15% and 20 MPs, we'll suddenly get 30% and have 200 MPs. And that sort of dream on the hill was always there, even if it was, even if it never came to pass until effectively this time with a hung Parliament. In my view, for rational people, that's gone. It's first past the post for Westminster. That's what it's going to be. And if the Liberal Democrats want to keep going on their present form, they have to realise they're going to be fighting first past the post elections for Westminster for the next 6, 7, 8 general elections. And I wonder whether some people might reach the conclusion that that is actually a thankless task.
Could I just have a question, make it quite quick, I have to shoot off. My name's Jack Johnson. I was just wondering, is it not counterintuitive for the government to be laying off sort of hundreds of thousands of public workers who are sort of, the state workers and whatever, and then the private sector not sort of absorb them? They're doing sort of not very fast absorption rate. Is it not counterintuitive then to say to be laying people off and the private sector not absorbing them, and then obviously you're going to see sort of an increase in the benefits being claimed because we've got employment. Would it not be better then for the government to create jobs instead of spending it on benefits? People could be working and contributing as well as earning money instead of sitting at home and just sort of doing nothing.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Plan B argument, basically, or an argument even for Keynesian fiscal stimulus. You're from the Labour.
I'm not officially, I just, yeah.
Right, okay. I mean, many people put the case rather more red-bloodedly than that. We're in trouble now, therefore let's spend 100 billion, recruiting more nurses and teachers for the sake of argument, and then they will be able to go out and spend their money on hairdressers and pub landlords, and then they'll be able to go and afford this, that and the other. I think that's a fool's gold. I don't think that will work. the crucial thing we have to make, because it would be wrong to say we were absolutely on the brink of disaster. We weren't quite as far as Greece, but we were approaching teetering on the brink, is you have got to make savings. You have got to save money. The government has got to save cash. And brutally, it is cheaper to pay someone £15,000 in unemployment benefits than it is to pay them £40,000 to be a local government officer. You have just saved yourself £25,000. And the idea, in my view, that you can encourage growth in the economy through that state spend side is a fiction. That £25,000 has got to come from somewhere. And the crowding out effect of that is almost instantaneous. I mean, essentially you're issuing bonds bought by the private sector in order to fund that £25,000 gap. That is therefore £25,000 worth of money which is no longer in the private sector. Barack Obama has attempted this policy to destruction. The US have gone down is it 960 billion or something? What the quantity of it? 900 billion fiscal stimulus package to an utterly bewildering lack of effect. I mean, absolutely zero effect. I mean, possibly will over the long run be negative because the bill's got to be paid back, right? I mean, it's a jam today, we'll pay it off tomorrow strategy. We've got the good fortune of there being a guinea pig on our doorstep, the United States of America. I mean, it's always difficult to isolate one particular thing, but he has attempted colossal fiscal stimulus, which was predicted and promised by his advisors would have this wonderful multiplier effect. And it has had no discernible effect at all, zero. I mean, immeasurably low. And the reason for that is that, in effect, there is a short time lag here, and I'm oversimplifying. Every pound you spend, you have got to find. And I don't mean that you literally have to find that out of immediate taxation. Of course you don't, you could borrow them. But if you borrow more, you have to find that pound by issuing a bond. And if you're selling that bond needs to be bought by somebody in the private sector. So it's just an elegant churn. I mean, you're just churning money. There might be other reasons for keeping as many nurses and doctors and teachers on 40 grand a year, but it will encourage economic growth reasons, to my mind, does not stack up. It is a transfer of cash from the private sector to the public sector. You've got to find money to do that, and for every pound that you take out of the private sector, which consistently shows much more ability to drive economic growth than the public sector, and the public sector isn't productive in typical terms. I mean, doctors and nurses and lollipop ladies might be lovely people, but they don't actually drive economic growth, certainly not in the short term. So I don't think that works at all. And you risk, I think now, that almost the government's own deficit reduction strategy is modest, too modest. The problem also more widely with this Keynesian argument is there never seems to be enough of it. There was never a point under the last Labour government where they said, oh, well, we're at the peak of the cycle, so we're going to run up a massive budget surplus this year in order to keep it all away for a rainy day for whenever things go wrong. No, it's always, seems to be permanently, in every circumstance that one finds, the Keynesians are saying, let's spend more. There's never been, I mean, Keynes himself will be spinning his grave. His view was, you know, you need to balance it up over the cycle. And we did not mend the roof while the sun was shining. We continually spent year on year more money than we had, foolishly, extremely foolishly, recklessly, in my view. And now it's the reckoning up time. Now, there's no easy way about this. The short-term dislocating effects of throwing 400,000 public sector workers out of jobs should not be underestimated. I mean, I don't rub my hands with glee on a human level at that prospect, but in economic terms, it makes perfect sense. And the road to ruin is to believe that what we always need is one more heave of fiscal stimulus, where we can see throughout history, and in the last few years in the United States of America, not identical economy, but a reasonable comparator, its impact has been zilch.
Yes, go.
This is more directed to your role as Director-General of the Institute of Affairs. Can you name your sources of funding for that body?
I can describe our source of funding, but I won't name it to you, and I'll explain why I won't name it to you as well. most of the stuff that I'm going to say to you is pretty readily available on the Company's House website, but to put it in broad brush terms and to make sure that you don't need to go through a spreadsheet, that you can hear it from my own lips. We have a turnover of almost exactly £1 million a year, so we're an absolutely microscopic organisation. I used to go to putative donors and say that you've got to understand that the Institute of Economic Affairs actually runs at the same annual budget as a single branch of Pizza Express, until one of the people I approached was the former chairman of Pizza Express, and he said, no, you are wrong, you are actually running on the annual turnover of about half of a branch of Pizza Express. So it's £1 million a year in broad terms, it's slightly above that, maybe 1.1 million. That money comes from the following 4 sources in approximately equal amounts. Firstly, we have our own endowment funds and legacies that have been left to us, which we either deplete or use the income of over time. So, for example, Ralph Harris, who was the first, not to be confused with Ralph Harris, who was the first director of the IEA, when he passed away, a fund was raised in his honour, and the income each year off that fund is used in part to pay my salary. We've had a couple of major legacies that we deplete over time, run them down over 5 years. And in broad terms, that probably accounts for about £200,000 a year of income. We then make about £100,000 a year, selling books, selling conference play, trading, about £100,000 a year. And the other £700,000 comes from a mixture which, off the top of my head, splits equally in about 3 ways. Firstly, companies give us money, anything from chump change to a few £1,000s a year, probably a couple of dozen of those. Individual philanthropists give us money, that would be our biggest income stream. So that's anything from being an IEA subscriber, which costs I think £42 a year, of whom there are 800, to being a very generous donor who writes a very substantial cheque. And thirdly, there are a range of charitable foundations that we apply to, who have a charitable objective to promote economic education, spread ideas about freedom, etc. And we make bids and approach them for grants as well. And in broad terms, those are about, so there's 4 income streams of broadly the same amount. I've had a long and ongoing argument with George Monbiot about whether we should put the list of everybody who gives us money in the public domain, and I think we shouldn't. I believe that it is perfectly acceptable for somebody to wish to give us money anonymously. We are obviously subject to all reasonable legal checks. We have to report, we have our accounts audited every year by Baker Tilly. We have to file at Company's House, and we have to file with the Charities Commission. And if any of them wanted to come in and say, we think you've received £250,000 from a Colombian arms dealer, then, believe me, that would come out in the wash. So we spend a lot of time and effort on making sure it all stacks up legally. I think it is entirely acceptable for an individual to say that they wish to give us money, but they do not wish to be named for that money or for the sum of money that they give us. I have no qualms about that at all. I don't think that the reasoning behind that need be in any way a suggestion of guilt or undue influence or anything of the like. One example, and in fact this is more than one example of this, is somebody who was relatively generous who was specifically asked not to be named. We have some people who specifically ask to be named. If I'm going to give you this amount of money, is my name going to be on a wall somewhere? Specifically didn't want to be named because he didn't then want to be approached by vast numbers of other free market orientated interests. So the minute it's on a website or listed that I give the IEA X, I'm going to be bombarded with people requesting that I start giving them X, and I don't want that. I just want to give it in my own private way. So I consider that to be a completely legitimate thing to do. I absolutely do not buy the argument that privacy means that you have something to hide. By way of analysis, I am willing to share with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs what I earn, but I don't consider it to be a matter of public interest. I don't believe I'm under an obligation to tell you what my salary is.
That's because well, that you're not in the public interest, no offense, but like the BBC.
So people who give me money are in the public
No,
interest.
you personally, your personal taxes, that's not like.
Well, but
So,
I mean, people who get the assertion, as I understand it, as to why we should release the names of our donors is that you would be concerned that people are buying undue influence over the political process. Is
well,
that right?
it's more to do with that, like in the mainstream media, the IEA is kind of used as sort of an unbiased commentator, and the worry is that.
Oh, yeah, I'm completely and utterly relaxed because as I say, privacy to my mind is totally acceptable. So, for the reasons I've stated, and you know, in the same way, there are some things that I would be willing to put in the public domain. But I'm not willing to put, say, details of my sex life in the public domain, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because it's nobody else's bloody business. Right?
But the IEA is a body that is in the public interest.
Yeah, but we.
Your sex life isn't.
Well, I mean, hang on. I mean, this to me, in my mind, seems a bit worrying. Are we going to insist? And this goes to this sort of lobbying register point. Actually, let me just come back to that 1 second. There's one thing I wanted to say, which is important about our internal protocols, which you may choose to disregard and disbelieve. I mean, I can only touch on your hearts what we do. We do not accept commissioned research. So we would not accept a petrol company phoning us up and saying, if you were to do a piece of research saying that petrol companies are brilliant and that the environmental lobby are terrible, we've got, you know, 20 grand burning a hole in our back pocket, we would not accept it. Our editorial, all of our research and editorial work is done wholly independently and blind of donors and peer reviewed, which is quite a lot to swallow for a very small organisation, actually. I mean, we could make ourselves eminently richer by being almost corporate consultants. You know, you pay us, we'll do the research and stamp the IEA brand on it. We could probably make quite a lot of money. We don't choose to do that, and we peer review everything. I don't think that there has been a single factual error in any IEA publication since 1955 when we were founded. You can choose to disagree with the argument, but I don't think anybody could claim that it's factually inaccurate. In terms of the lobbying point, what are we saying here? Are we saying that the minute that you give any interview on BBC News Channel, the finances of your organisation need to be put into the public domain?
Well, we're saying that if it's just the danger, like, I'm not accusing you of it, of course, but the danger is that if the IEA is quoted as sort of an unbiased commentator on the economy, but if its funding is from certain companies, the worry, and to dispel that worry, transparency.
Yeah, I'm not sure. You said I'm not sure I agree with you because I mean, firstly, I've given you good reasons why I think something. By the way, we don't insist on anonymity. Any donor who wishes to stand up and say, I give the IEA money and this is how much, that's perfectly fine. We don't insist that the money, that we leave that to the individual donor to decide. So I think you'll find most companies that give us money will declare it in their accounts. It's not, you know, you wouldn't need to be Sherlock Holmes to work it out. But what I object to is the assertion, which is the George Monbiot style assertion, that somebody's views, is a Marxist view, are derived from where they get their money from, rather than the other way round. And the truth of the matter is that I don't think we are seen or presented as an unbiased commentator, by the way. We do have a mission, which is to promote free markets. You know, we're not like the Institute of Fiscal Studies. We promote free markets. We take a range of views. I mean, we don't have a corporate position, policy position, but we take a range of views on a wide range of issues. And therefore, unsurprisingly, those who are sympathetic with those views write us checks. And I just don't want to fall for the argument that we have those views because of the checks. We don't. We have the checks because of the views that we're promulgating. And I think there's a real danger, especially from leftist groups who are often receiving taxpayers' money, that receiving money from the public purse is somehow neutral. But receiving money from, I don't know, a tobacco company means that your view should never be listened to.
I mean, it's not that, it's just that transparency would solve that debate completely.
Well, it wouldn't solve it because we already spend, I would think, 10% or more of our income on compliance and auditing and accountancy and God knows what else, you know, legal advice. What sort of precise burden would you be imposing upon me and what forms will I have to fill in?
It wouldn't be forms you have to fill in, you just have to name the companies that contribute to.
Oh, the companies, not the individuals?
Well, yeah, well, both. I think I have a strong argument on companies.
Right, so, well, if both, I mean, then that would make a big difference. And sometimes it's a bit grey.
if supposing it's the chief executive of a company that writes a personal cheque of a family-owned business, is that a personal cheque or a company cheque?
Well, it depends on his capacity. If it's within the influence of his company, then I mean you can skip it by just saying it's personal. But
well, if it's an entirely family-owned business, there's
well,
no
your reasons for not have been entirely centred on the individual. So I was just talking about. So I thought, well, what about companies then?
Well, I think that's. I mean, I take the same basis to any corporate structure, whether it's an individual. I would be horrified if I had to put the name of our 800 subscribers at 42 quid a year. I mean, do we think that political parties should have to release their membership list?
No. Maybe I'm not making myself clear. Sorry. If a company is contributing, then surely that's not. There's no privacy to a company and companies out there.
It's entirely up to them. It's entirely up to them.
But then, yeah, it's entirely up to them for them to contribute to you. But is it
and entirely up to them how they wish to present this in their accounts. I mean, BP, for example, have a policy that they list all of the groups that they donate money to. We're one of them, and it's listed on their website. But a good number of the companies who give to us have been small family-owned businesses, not FTSE 100 companies.
Okay.
And at that point, it's at that point it's very difficult to know. I think that any regulation, I mean, I'm against doing this because I believe in the right to privacy, and I reject the assertion that our views are because of where the money's coming from. They're just simply not. But the regulatory burden that might be introduced here, I think, is potentially insane. And this feeds into the discussion about this lobbyists register, that may come in the light of the Liam Fox thing. I mean, I imagine I will be caught by that. I may well be categorised as a lobbyist. I have no idea what a lobbyist means, really. Anybody who goes and advocates anything ever seems to be a lobbyist. And I'm then not quite sure what I will need to fill in order to comply with this lobbyist register were I to be caught by it. If I meet a Conservative MP in the Dog and Duck pub in Westminster and buy him half a pint of beer while we discuss the challenges of deregulation in the...
Now you're exaggerating.
Well, no, I'm not exaggerating, but is that claimable or not?
Well, no, because obviously then you have to declare half a pint.
Well, what level would you have to claim?
You have to be. You could list them on a blog post. People that contribute to the ESG and economic affairs wouldn't have to be like.
Well,
list for them.
Right, and only companies, and only FTSE 100.
Well, I think we're not going to agree on privacy. I think you should list all of them. You don't. You just say on companies.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I've never heard it broken down that way. I think the problem that you would have there is that, and it's not from our point of view, we don't mind. I would imagine every company that gives money to us announces it in their own accounts. I mean, other than small family concerns, I mean, don't go through that process as much. Smaller companies own, quite a lot of city-based practices are very small, very successful, but very small. So I think you're in all sorts of. Once you open Pandora's box and say, well, we're going to list companies, then why not the individuals? And then if the individuals, why not all 1,000 of them, rather than just individuals above a certain amount? Or if it's above a certain amount, is that per year or per quarter? So if it's, let's say, £1,000 a quarter, do people start...
It's just the principle of transparency. I think we're getting bogged down in the details.
Yeah, well, the principle, I don't believe in the principle of transparency because I don't think there's anything that discernible from those accounts that could possibly inform any rational or reasonable person's views about our work.
It's not trying to inform. It's just to show that who's like funded, that who's
why? In whose interest is that?
It's not for like an end. It's more for like a sort of general transparency that I think is a healthy thing to have in all.
Yeah, no, but I think it gets much more particular than that because you immediately start to get down. No, we only want to know the companies. We don't care about the individuals.
We're not going to reach
yes. And that to my mind is wrong here. I mean, if we receive £1 million from Bill Gates, that doesn't have to be declared, but £10,000 from Microsoft does. That, to my mind, isn't transparency. That's a kind of falling for an anti-corporate culture, in my view, that company donations are somehow mucky and dirty, but individual donations are a legitimate part of civil society.
I was bringing up transparency, but let's leave it at that.
Does anybody have any other questions pertaining to the talk? Okay, I have a question, if that's okay. When I tell people I'm a libertarian, I'm always accused of being selfish, of leaving the little old lady cold, and not caring about people dying in the streets. How would you refute that? Because that is very unrepresentative.
Yeah, I think the problem that we're trying to fight back against is this view that there are certain things that will only be done if the state doesn't. And this is, I think, a very common one is healthcare. You know, that if you're sceptical or even against the National Health Service, it is assumed that you are against healthcare, rather than that you're against this particular delivery mechanism for healthcare. It's a difficult one, and it's something I think all libertarians tend to stand accused of. The way I answer it is that do we really, is your opponent in this case really saying that the only way to provide people with the things they need is through a state mechanism? So we presumably think that the relatively poor people in this country should have shoes and food, but we do not have state-run shoe shops and state-run food shops. State-run food shops was attempted in the Soviet Union to catastrophic effect. Actually, Walmart, Asda, Safeway, Tesco's and the like are providing food considerably better than President Ceausescu was able to do in Romania. So I think it is to argue that the proof is, or the empirical evidence suggests that a market delivery mechanism enormously helps on providing, those at poorer ends of society, a far better service than a state delivery mechanism, food and shoes and some of the basics that we provide in the free market, broadly free market context, seem to me to be really good examples of that. If you want to duck the question a bit, sounds slightly intellectually dishonest, but if you want to swerve around it a bit, I think that, which I sometimes do with those of a sort of more left-leaning persuasion, is say, let's divorce two issues: redistribution and state provision of services. Let's look at these completely different. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, there is a case that we should take money from the rich and give it to the poor. And you might even want to do this until everybody's on exactly the same level of income, if you really want to go that far. But having done that, having redistributed income in whatever way you consider to be the best, whatever, guaranteeing everybody more than 10 grand, or making sure the gap between rich and poor is only so big, then leave the market to decide. So by all means give people the cash directly through a redistributive welfare system. I appreciate one's already potentially surrendering some ground here, but do it through redistributing cash, not through the provision of the service. Then allow the individual to decide whether they want to buy this service from that doctor or from this doctor, or whether they want to go to that school or the other school. And that's effectively what we do with food, isn't it? I mean, we transfer cash to people, they then decide whether they spend it in Londis or Asda or at Sainsbury or Safeways. So we would have a much more market-orientated system, even if there was the same size of the state, but it was just entirely a redistribution of wealth. So I would argue against the state structure point that once you redistribute that cash, then you can allow people to go and buy the best product in the market. And the impoverishment of people can be solved by that mechanism, not by the direct state provision of services.
Can I just interject? In terms of provision of cash every year to purchase healthcare provision, would that be proportional against people's disabilities, or would it be an annual?
Could make it that. I mean, I'm not massively enthusiastic about a guaranteed national, income for everybody. You could make it that. I'm saying, pick whatever system you want. You could, you could give more to elderly people, less to young people, more to fat people, less to thin people, whatever breakdown you want. Pick however you wish to redistribute it, but then get the hell out of the way. Then, so you decide what you consider to be a just distribution, whether more should go to disabled people or old people or whatever, people with mental health problems. You decide. But once you've decided that distribution, get out of the way. Don't try and say, you have to see this doctor, you must go to that school. Leave all of that to be provided by the free market.
Isn't redistribution itself arbitrary and a bit immoral?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is arbitrary and a bit immoral. I mean, I'm with Hayek. I think there should be a safety net. I think there should be a basic minimum safety net. But I think you've got to make very sure that safety net doesn't become a comfort blanket. is pretty problematic, in my view, morally, to forcibly take property from one person who legitimately owns it and give it to somebody else. But I think there is a modest justification for that, to provide a popular and safety net. But my point was, in terms of persuading those who are very wedded to, say, the National Health Service or state education, in terms of persuading them, I'd say, well, let's just go for, pick your redistribution, however you want to do it. You know, we'll come back another day to argue about whether we should redistribute any money at all, but pick whatever your perfect redistribution of cash mechanism is, but then do nothing else.
So that's a sort of ceteris paribus, in a way, to demonstrate that the
well,
market...
I haven't heard anybody suggest that we should, again, go back to what I was saying at the start about the success of Thatcher. I haven't heard anybody suggest we should nationalise Asda or Safeways. So as long as everybody had enough money to access their healthcare, decide how much you think that should be, why on earth why should there be a presumption you get it from the National Health Service? Why would that be any different to the provision of food or clothes?
About health, the strawmen, they usually are, well, I'm for disbanding the National Health Service. I do believe in minimum welfare that you fall back on if you fail, like very minimum one. But the strawman usually built up is that we'll become like America, where people die because they don't have private insurance. But several economies in the world do have two-tier systems, which is public-private, which is minimum. And
I've got
also
private health provisions, so we've got a two-tier system here.
True, and also they have very successful countries which also export their healthcare because it is cheap, viable, and regular people can afford it. So, what would your ideal health system look? And does it mean that if we weren't to have the NHS, that we would, that we would be beset by the worst humanitarian crises?
No, I mean, the whole American things, the American system in my view is probably a bit better than ours overall. There are some downsides to it. It's a hell of a lot more expensive than ours. I do get bored of the binary argument that sort of you've either got to have the NHS exactly as it is, or you've got to have the American system exactly as that is. The American system isn't the best one in the world. Probably it's a bit of a second best option. It's not a pure libertarian option, the Singapore system, which is people are forced to make personal savings into their savings account, their income. The poor get those topped up, and you effectively have your annual budget to go and spend on healthcare for non-critical treatment. I mean, all these myths about if you're involved in a road accident in America, you have to get your credit card out by the side of the road before you bleed to death is all nonsense, and it doesn't happen. But in Singapore, they bring in quite a lot of patient power and quite a lot of tough decisions for the patient. It's better than an insurance system because you effectively are rationed by a budget. For non-critical illness, you're rationed by a budget. And there are benefits for you not spending all of the budget. I think eventually it gets wrapped up in your pension or some state pension or something, you don't spend it all. So you're cost conscious as a patient. Unlike somebody on the National Health Service, they're not cost conscious at all. They just I want my treatment as soon as possible with the best doctor possible, give it to me. And also unlike an insurance system, that once you've won your claim that you are indeed covered for this accident, you want the best surgeon in the world to patch you up as fast as you can. The great thing about the Singapore system is you're price sensitive. So to give you an example, not being a professional footballer, if I receive a knee injury, but, as long as I can basically walk, if I'm in a little bit of pain in my knee, no big deal. I'll probably want it looked at in the next 6 or 8 weeks. I don't need the best knee surgeon on the planet. I'll happily accept kind of bronze level rather than platinum level treatment, and I'll pay you 500 quid for it. Clearly, if I was a professional sportsman, a professional sportsman might pay an absolute mint to go public, but I needed to use my knee every day, quite flexibly. I would say, oh, well, this is important to me. I actually want gold treatment, and I really need it this week. Similarly, in my job, if something happened to me 4 or 5 years ago, I had a nodule on my throat. Well, I trade on my voice. This clearly was something that I had to prioritise. Whereas you can imagine other people who had a nodule on their throat, meaning their voice was very scratchy and they couldn't speak very much, might be an annoyance, but nothing like as big an annoyance as, twisting a finger or something if you're a concert pianist. So it makes a whole plethora of decisions price sensitive. It's not a purist libertarian system because you are obliged to pay into it. But it has that market element, which I think is enormously more attractive than either the American or basically any insurance-based system, where you basically get into a fight with your insurer about whether you're covered or not. If you're not, you're up the gum tree. If you are, you rattle up huge medical bills and send them all to your insurance company. And similarly in the NHS, it's basically how good a lobbyist are you, and it's the pushy middle class who tend to rise to the top. Singapore system, you've got a lot of price control being done by the patient. I think there's an awful lot to commend that. And overall, on the outrun of results, I mean, these things are difficult to measure. It seems that Singapore has overall about the same sort of health outcomes as the National Health Service, at about half the cost per capita, simply because these price controls and encouragement of competition.
Any more questions? I have another criticism levied at us is that, for instance, a lot of libertarians believe that education should be paid for, especially past the tertiary level, because it's differentiating yourself, not only for the job market, but also for utility purposes, because you enjoy studying a particular subject. And they claim that it's immoral and that it impedes social mobility. What would your response be?
Well, it's just, I don't think it's being borne out by the facts, isn't it? I mean, the increase of tuition fees to £9,000 has had a very, very modest downward impact on applications. So it isn't borne out by the facts. And it seems evident. I think that when you say people, what you mean is your fellow students, so obviously potentially those who are suffering. My impression of the wider electorate was there's absolutely no sympathy at all to speak of those who are demanding that tuition fees were scrapped or reduced to, not brought up to £9,000 a year. No sympathy at all. Clearly, within the organised group of undergraduates or soon-to-be undergraduates, that's an organised lobby group who are getting it in the neck. But amongst the wider public, I think it's pretty clear that you're the beneficiary of your education, both in terms of the general enjoyment of it and the likely enhanced earning power it gives you. You should be paying for it. I think there is a different, much more nuanced argument about children, by the way. I don't think that you can expect a 7-year-old to turn up with their credit card or take out a student loan in order to get some basic maths tuition. I don't know how I'd deal with that. There may be some state support. I think I would probably frame it more as a parental obligation. So in the same way that there are legal obligations on a parent to make sure the kid is fed and watered and doesn't freeze to death and has a roof over their head, I think you could say that there is an obligation to make sure that the child receives an education up to standard, however you want to set it. But I think I'd probably do it that way around. But once you get to somewhere around the 16, 18 mark, I mean, you can have ages, debates endlessly about where the age of consent should sort of kick in, and when somebody does become an adult, you're on your own. And a lot of the evidence in terms of social mobility from, say, America, colossally more expensive to go to Harvard than it is to go to Cambridge or Oxford, is that social mobility is, if anything, encouraged. And that the institutions themselves make quite progressive decisions. So you might be charged, I don't know, $40,000 a year to do a Harvard degree, but $2,000 or $3,000 of that is put aside for a bursary program. Alumni of the universities give a lot of money back to the universities to encourage grants to poorer students. So it doesn't seem to me, I've not seen the evidence that more fee-paying systems harm social mobility and that ours has encouraged it, far from it.
Sure, you make a very interesting point, because primary and secondary education obviously goes to the realm of dependency. And India is a very interesting case study. I'm Indian, so I can speak for it. For a long time, we had a public sector where our children went to school free, especially if you were a girl, and then the private sector, which had competitive schools that you paid for and the middle classes could afford. But what you had emerging was very inferior quality from public schools and and superior quality from private schools. So over the years, what the government did is that it saw that the market was far more efficient because public school teachers wouldn't go to school and such like. And so what they did is that they have a voucher system that people who absolutely needed free education would, and this system is yet to be perfected, would be able to apply to schools of their choice, and that the state would pay if absolutely necessary. Also about the dependency point, you brought up the very important point of familial obligation, which seems to be lacking in advanced Western democracies, whereby the state is seen as the insurer of your comfort and well-being, whereas the family's role is quite taken away from, in a way. So what makes a society different in that one cannot rely on one's family more concretely than families in Asia who see education as an investment?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's crowding out. I mean, the more the state acts like a parent or a mother, the less you rely on or look to your actual parent or mother. And not just in a family sense, I think in a neighbourly sense as well. I've lived in the same block of apartments in London for 9 years now. I can't name my neighbour. I haven't got a clue who they are. As far as I'm concerned, if they get sick, well, it's up for the state to sort them out. If they get hungry, that's up to Meal on Wheels. You know, that all of my obligations to my immediate community have been almost stripped from me, to the sense that one feels virtually no obligation at all. I mean, don't get me wrong, if somebody falls over in the pavement in front of me, I'd help them to their feet, but the general lack of interest that I think people now have in the immediate world around them, because so much responsibility has been taken on by the state, and it's a straight crowding out argument, really. The more that the state takes on that role, the less people take it on for themselves, and that seems to me pretty clear across the board.
Okay. I can hear the heaving and sighing in the room, which means we've had a very fulfilling debate, maybe one that's far prolonged, and you, of course, Mark, being the champion of it because you've had to weather all of it. And so now, without any further strain on any of our parts, do feel free to join us at the Dirty Duck and wind down a bit. Thank you for coming.